Hi everyone, this is the overview for chapter 4. And so I'm just going to uh, not go over the statistics and really just delve into the types of homicides that we see. Um, the global perspective on homicide, that's where I'm going to start. Homicide rates are higher in developing countries, which might or might not be a surprise to you. However, among post-industrialized countries, the United States has the highest rate. So if you compare us to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, most of Europe, etc., we have a much higher rate. And of course, that might be due to the much more widely availability of guns in the United States. Most of these other places that I mentioned do not allow access to guns quite as easily as we do in the US. Of course, they also don't have the Second Amendment. Um, we do, even though we are a wealthy country, we do have fairly high poverty rates compared to those other post-industrialized nations that are very similar to us. Latin America has some of the highest homicide rates. Um, Sociologists believe this might be part of that due to the culture of machismo, where masculinity, you must defend your masculinity, must you prove your masculinity, which then therefore may lead men to get into physical aggression, which then leads to one person dying or being killed. However, in every culture, it seems that men are much more likely to kill than women are. And Unfortunately, in highly patriarchal societies, such as the Middle East, women are much more likely to be victims of honor killings. School violence. School violence is very top of mind right now, I would say, because of the, excuse me, the very recent mass shooting in Uvalde, Texas, where 19 children, elementary school children, and 2 teachers were killed. Um, the first type of school violence that I can remember was Columbine in 1998. Um, but of course, there was a shooting on Kent State University's campus in Ohio back in 1966, I believe it was, which I think counts as school violence as well. A gunman opened fire on students who were protesting on that campus. Um, we've seen a number of these instances, and it's not always clear to those of us on the outside um, in regard to why that individual went out and opened fire at a school. The most recent situation in Uvalde, Texas, um, the young man was killed by police, and so we will never know what the true motives of that person were. Um, we we know very little, in fact, about that individual. Um, at Columbine, there was some evidence that the 2 young men who opened fire and killed a number of fellow students, that they were, not the popular kids, they were somewhat nerdy. But then there was also some suggestion that they had watched The Matrix, which is why they dressed a certain way. Again, they were killed by police, so we may never know the real reason why they opened fire in their own high school. Stalking. Stalking is when a person pursues someone else, call that person the victim, who does not want to be pursued, which then causes that victim to feel fearful of being assaulted or possibly even killed, because the stalker often will spy on the individual, will follow them, will show up unexpectedly at places where they are, at a cafe or where they're shopping or near their work, etc. And so for a person who's being stalked, it can be very, very scary. And many states have passed laws against stalking. There didn't used to be laws against stalking, but because this became much more common, the stalking, laws began to be passed in states. Um, Many stalkers either know their victims either as somebody that they used to date or be in a relationship with, or a fellow employee, but often stalkers focus on someone who is, they don't even know, they've never even met, in fact. A celebrity, for example, becomes their focus. And even though they've never met this person and probably have no chance of ever meeting this person, they stalk this person. And again, most stalkers are males, and the victims are females. Hate killings, unfortunately, are uh, quite prevalent in the US. According to more recent FBI data, about 7,000 Americans experience hate crimes. And overall, the individuals who are most likely to be targets of hate crimes are African Americans, and LGBTQ individuals. Although um, there have been instances in which people who are not LGBTQ have been targeted simply because the ignorant person who is doing the killing just assumes that that person is in fact LGBTQ. There was a shooting at a nightclub, I believe it was in Florida. This is about 5 years ago. Some of you may have remembered it. It was if I remember correctly, a Middle Eastern man who opened fire and killed a number of LGBTQ individuals at this nightclub because he believed that, according to his religion, these were people who were, going to go to hell, and I guess he felt like he needed to send them much more quickly. Three types of killers. Hate killers are the thrill killers, those who are feeling marginalized, they feel alienated, they don't feel included within society, they're often loners. And so engaging in these kinds of attacks makes them feel powerful. Defensive hate killers are those who feel like they have to defend their birthright, right? They've got to defend their country. And mission killers, individuals who believe that it's their duty to kill all as many members of the hated group as they can. Dylan Roof is an example of that. He killed 9 people at an African American church back in 2015. But more recently, the young white male who drove 200 miles from his home to Buffalo, New York, who killed, I believe it was 9 African Americans who were shopping at a grocery store in their neighborhood. And then in 2019, a number of brown people were killed in El Paso, Texas, at a Walmart by another white man, young white male, who drove several hundred miles out of his way to go to a place where he knew there would be a lot of brown people. Genocide. Genocide is the killing of a racial, ethnic, or even religious groups, and many have occurred. Instances of this have occurred throughout history around the world. Victims are killed for who they are. Not because they're good people or bad people or the character or any of that, just because they are who they are. And often the people who are doing the killing are, quote, normal people, but because they believe in the leader, the person who's telling them to kill, if they're given that order, they believe that they're doing their duty. In fact, this is the exact defense that some Nazi soldiers who were prosecuted in Nuremberg after World War II ended said that that's why they had killed people in concentration camps, because they were told to do it. They were soldiers and they were carrying out their orders. Bystanders are often people who do nothing to stop the genocide, and it's not necessarily because they're bad people. It's just that many of them have obedience to authority, or they may be fearful of some sort of retaliation if they try to speak up or stop the killing. Some of these individuals maybe come to believe that these people are inferior because they've dehumanized these individuals. If you can think of somebody as subhuman, then it doesn't really matter to you how these people are treated or what is done to them. And terrorism also, we see and have will very likely continue to see terrorism in the United States. Probably one incident that most people know about. If you weren't alive yet, many of you probably weren't, but you may have heard of it, 9/11. But back in 2015, I believe it was, there was a bombing at the Boston Marathon. Two brothers, the Tsarnaev brothers, were guilty of that. One brother died while they were trying to evade police. They were able to evade police for a couple days. The other brother is currently in prison. In 1995, a young man named Timothy McVeigh killed a number of people in a federal building in Oklahoma. He was angry at the government. He was a former, he was a veteran, and he didn't like the way that the government treated him after his service to the country. And so he blew up a government building, which of course meant that a number of the people that he killed had nothing to do with his grievances. Why do people kill? Well, two ideas, the external restraint theory and the subcultural violence theory. External restraint theory is focused on how much restraint a person feels, whether they have a lot of strong external restraint or not. The thinking is this: somebody who has very little external restraint, weak external restraint, this is a person who has a lot of opportunities, has been educated, has had a fairly comfortable life, and yet still feels frustrated because perhaps they don't feel like they've been as successful as they should have been, that they haven't achieved what they should have, or they haven't received what they should have. But they can't really blame anyone because they know, hey, I've had a fairly comfortable life. I've had a good education. I've had all these opportunities. So since they can't blame anyone but themselves, they turn their aggression onto themselves and commit suicide. On the other hand, someone who experiences a lot of external restraint, the quote, the man is keeping them down, the boss at work, or, the landlord and the teacher, etc. They feel a lot of anger and frustration, and they can blame others for their lack of success. They can blame others for their failure. And so they are much more likely to turn their aggression outward and onto the people that they feel are the cause of their lack of success. On the other hand, the subcultural violence theory argues that there's this underlying subculture of violence in poor neighborhoods. That is, that violence has become a way of life for poor people. That's how they've learned to deal with their problems, to act out aggressively toward others who are causing them problems. And so that violent attitude, that violent behavior becomes how they deal with every transgression in their lives. And so it is not therefore uncommon that at some point some aggression will turn deadly. And finally, does the death penalty deter? You will read in the text that there's a pretty strong argument. Sociologists, most of us, believe that the death penalty really is not very effective in deterring murder. If we're talking about general deterrence, it's really not effective. Yeah, we know. Specific deterrence, of course it is. If we put someone to death, they're never ever going to commit murders again. But when we look at the evidence before us, and even if you look at the statistics cited in the text, and the murder rate in states where the death penalty is used is about 5.15, whereas The death penalty in states that don't use the death penalty is about 4.13. It's about a 25% difference. Logically, you would expect that if the death penalty does in fact work, that the states that use the death penalty would have lower, in fact, probably much lower homicide rates, and yet they don't. And so, you don't have to agree with me. I encourage you to do more research on your own and to really think about how much the death penalty really does deter or prevent others from engaging in murder because they see somebody else who has the death penalty imposed upon them. That is it for this chapter.